the Business and Nature Pavilion at the World Conservation Congress in Marseille. It's a great pleasure to welcome all our guests that are here on live stream and on the internet, but also all you that are sitting here in the audience. As you know, we are on a silent pavilion, so use the headsets as you can't hear us and we are not disturbing our neighbors. We've got a fantastic panel with us and interesting topic today. Can I have the next slide, please? Or should I use a clicker that I have here, yeah? That's okay. So the title of this session is Race to Zero Dialogue on Nature. And this was an idea that we had when we created this pavilion, and we were seeing the critical timing in which we are, which is the World Conservation Congress of IUCN is happening just before COP26 on the climate side, even if it was supposedly to be just before COP15 on the biodiversity side, but now they have reversed the clock and COP15 comes after. But let's seize that as an opportunity, because we know that there was a lot done on the race to zero for the climate topic. And what we really want to understand and hear from our great participants is how does that actually integrate nature, or how do we make sure that the race to zero on climate actually doesn't go at the expense of nature? So that's really what we are trying to do here today. But for that, we are extremely privileged to have actually Nigel Topping with us. As the UK high-level climate action champion, you are clearly at a very strategic place to actually address the topic and to tell us a bit more about this. You have the ears of the UK government as well, but also traditionally Nigel has been quite involved in all these topics as, you know, CEO of We Mean Business previously, and having been a key actor also in setting up the Business for Nature coalition, where we were actually in some of these meetings by how do we bring this coalition together where business can really commit to nature. So what I'll do is ask you to introduce a little bit of topic, and then afterwards I will be presenting the other panelists, and so that you can get in a conversation with these great company representatives. But I'll let you just do a little bit of introduction on the actual topic.
Great, thanks you, Gerard. That's working? Yeah. First of all, I mean, it's a real honour to be here. I feel like I'm the person who knows the least about the subject matter here, because this is there's so much sort of rich understanding and expertise around the issues of nature and biodiversity here. And really the reason I'm here is working really hard, and I'm really excited actually the extent to which climate and biodiversity have come together in the last few years to be much more aligned in the eyes of many stakeholders, governments, NGOs, etc. I actually remember a rather sad meeting about, I think it's only about, it was the Fiji COP, so that was in Bonn in 2017, so not long ago. Halfway through the COP, about 10 of us in the corner of one of these big halls, but an empty hall with a whiteboard kind of saying, how are we going to get climate and conservation to be aligned and not be two separate communities? So because they are two separate communities in some ways, but I think particularly around the sectors that are most affected, so the food and agriculture in particular, I think they're really coming together, and I think that's been a real theme here, and so I'm really delighted to be here. I should just explain that for those of you who are not geeky followers of the UN climate process, a high-level climate action champion was a creation of the Paris Agreement in recognition of the fact that it takes a whole of society to tackle the climate, and I would add the biodiversity crises, and that we need to mobilise what the UN system calls non-state actors, which you can think of really as businesses, investors, cities, states and regions, remembering that they have huge economic and regulatory power between them to influence systems change. And I work closely with Gonzalo Munoz, who's the Chilean appointed high-level champion. So although we're appointed by our governments, we work to a UN mandate, not for the individual governments that appointed us. And we're really trying to accelerate what we call the ambition loop, which is the feedback loop between national governments and those non-state actors, so that as more businesses and more cities and more regions take action on a particular topic and set bold targets and start to implement them. It actually creates political space for policymakers at a national level to be bolder. And of course, similarly, you can't actually achieve full transition without the right policy frameworks being in place. And more ambitious policy both raises the floor, but then encourages the leaders of non-state actors to go even further. We've seen a lot of that leadership in different sectors, particularly I would say from mayors and the private sector. So the role was created in Paris, and then in the COP22 in Morocco, the Marrakesh Partnership was formed, and that's a very big network of hundreds of mostly NGOs, some multilateral bodies who work with businesses, cities, investors, and regions, and they're organised around 9 themes, 3 of which are particularly relevant for the biodiversity and nature agenda: land, which we think of as food and nature on land, fresh water, and ocean. So the overlap is very clear. Gonzalo and I have been working really hard with the Marrakesh partnership, and the IUCN, I should say, are the thematic lead on the land theme, and have been great partners, including lending us some resource so that we can embed nature in all of our thinking much more intelligently. We've been working really hard to, because this is quite a special construct, right, of non-state actors, where the mandate of the champions is simply to drive ambition and action in support of the Paris Agreement. And because of the obvious overlap with those themes and the need to support the Paris Agreement and the other Rio conventions, we work really hard with all the partners to make sure we're not just thinking about greenhouse gas emissions, we're also thinking about what are the systemic outcomes that we're looking for on those biodiversity and desertification agendas. So I'll say a little bit about Race to Zero, which is the main topic. But Paris has 3 legs. It has a resilience leg, a finance leg, and a mitigation leg. So we have 3 campaigns to tackle those 3. And again, these are about what I call radical collaboration, like trying to get gazillions of people to align around the same goals, which then de-risks it for everybody, which means we can all go faster, and then we have that really nice ratchet mechanism. So I know that the topic's Race to Zero, so I'll come to that last, but really importantly, for the nature agenda also is resilience, because many of the solutions to resilience are nature-based solutions, whether that's mangrove restoration or reforestation, which of course, or prevention of deforestation, which of course affects both resilience and mitigation. So we have a Race to Resilience, which is a campaign focused on making 4 billion lives more resilient by 2030, and it's focused particularly on the most vulnerable communities, coastal and river-based communities, the urban poor and smallholder farmers. And a third campaign we call the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, in partnership with Mark Carney, who's the Secretary General's Special Envoy. And there we have amassed so far over 250 asset owners, asset managers, banks and insurers who are all committed to aligning their portfolios and their balance sheets with net zero by 2050, which is in line with the Race to Zero. But really importantly there, for example, for Glasgow, we're looking to have at least 40 of those major financial institutions commit to deforestation-free portfolio. So we're used to the idea of deforestation-free supply chains for food companies, but we're going to, so that finance is often the biggest lever. So we're really trying to, and that's really, I would say 2 years ago, that was a very small group, and we've managed, I think in partnership with Mark Carney and using the Biden summit as a forcing event to make that quite a big tent. So Race to Zero. So the idea of the Race to Zero is twofold. First of all, it's just to make getting to zero as fast as possible the North Star that everyone shares. That absolutely wasn't the case 2 years ago. I actually think as a community we've made huge progress on that, of course helped by the IPCC report. And I mean the one on the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, of course the latest one just ups the pressure on that. Also helped by a lot of great work done by many stakeholders in identifying that there are pathways to zero in every sector. So it's not a question of if we can get there, but where's the political will from all actors and how fast will we get there? And a lot of what we're trying to do is make that more of a competitive conversation rather than a should we, shall we, how will we? If you like, trying to point to the fact in Glasgow that the train is leaving the station in nearly every sector. But as well, so we have that umbrella aim to get as many commitments as possible to net zero in a credible way. Credible is important. So any mayor or CEO can commit to net zero in 2050, confident that they will not be around to be, they might be alive, but they won't be in position. maybe some very rare cases where you've got some 25-year-old CEOs who've just started an amazing business, but you know the normal demographic of a CEO or a mayor. So also really important is that they have to publish a plan and commitments for the next 10 years, so the same kind of cycle as NDCs, and then publish, and then get on with delivering them, and then publish progress on them so they can be held accountable by everybody. So that's a sort of headline campaign just to get as much momentum as possible. Over 3,000 businesses. I think we'll have 1,000 cities by Glasgow. Those 250 financial institutions. I think we'll have 1,000 universities as well, and maybe up to 300 regions with half the GDP and a quarter of the population of the world. So importantly, this sort of fractal nature of actually the way societies are organised really helps, especially when politics at one level, if you like, is no longer helpful. So think America under Trump, really helpful to have city mayors and state governors and CEOs committing to acting nevertheless. Similarly in Brazil right now, we've just had the states of Pernambuco, Minas Gerais and Sao Paulo join the race to zero, so that helps keep momentum going. In many ways more interesting is the sectoral work. We've now just published the third generation of 1.5 degree pathways for 29 sectors, which say who has to do what by when, supply, demand, finance, policy, technology. And then to really simplify this, because some of those are like 100-page documents, we define for every sector 2 breakthrough points. One is an ambition breakthrough where we get more than 20% of the key actors in a sector in the race to zero. We've just passed that in cement. Amazingly, 30% by volume of the main cement companies have now committed to getting to zero before 2050. 2 years ago, no one would have believed you if it said that would happen. So we're seeing real momentum increasing. And the second and more interesting one is the outcome breakthrough, which is an actual real economy to breakthrough in terms of cost or volume or emissions reduction, depending on the sector, to be delivered by 2030. In the case of many sectors, there's a huge overlap, and we've tried to include what are the emerging post-2020 targets from the biodiversity agenda. So we seek to get 20% of all food companies in the race to zero, but of course we're focusing then systemically things like regenerative agriculture, millions of hectares of restoration, eliminating deforestation from supply chains, the kind of things that you'll all be familiar with, because of course they're both delivering on biodiversity and on emissions reductions. I mean, you all know that 25% of the problem, 30% of the solution. So that's what we're trying to do with the race to zero, get as many people as possible in, and then get a critical mass in every sector so that we can then focus on the systemic changes needed from all actors to get to the actual physical breakthrough that we need to reach between 2025 and 2030. And I'll stop there, Jared.
Great, thank you very much, Nigel, for this introduction. And we are showing it's a whole series of races that we are embarking into. So it's not just as simple as a race to zero, but there's a race for resilience and a race to have more financial support as well.
I like to call that one the race to trillions.
The race to trillions, that's right. I thought it was billions, but okay, now we go to trillions.
No, this is a really important point, is that there's a for understandable reasons, an obsession with the figure of 100 billion in the context of the negotiations, because rich countries have promised to mobilize at least 100 billion a year in climate finance for emerging and developing countries. But to solve the problem, we need to mobilize trillions. So the 100 billion is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And the main difference is mobilizing the private sector. So it really is about a question of moving, yes, delivering the committed billions, but it has to be translated into trillions. Because if you just got to 200 billion of public money and didn't mobilise private finance, you wouldn't solve the issue of either mitigation or adaptation in emerging and developed economies.
Thank you for that clarification. And that's exactly where we want to go into it, is this second phase, which is hearing from these companies out there that are already engaged in this race and actually see, how can they be agents of bringing more support to this, and what are some of the needed changes, but also what are some of the risks and the opportunities out there. So we're extremely privileged to have a panel, and I have to really thank my colleague Julia, that has organized this meeting for us and has been able to go and pull very special people on this panel in the maze of all the other events that are happening this week. So I'm going to start with first Prune Poisson. So you are the Chief Sustainability Officer of Accor. But actually a lot of people might not know you as the Chief Sustainability Officer of Accor and member of the Executive Committee, because they might remember you much more as the Secretary of State, for the environment, which you were quite recently. And this is probably the fantastic experience that we'd like to hear from you as well, having been in the private sector before you took on some more other duties at the European Parliament. Back then in the French politics, really at the center there of the environmental stream, and now for the Groupe Accor with all these many hotels, and how much you influence perhaps the infrastructure that we're looking at going forward. And the built environment is of course one of these streams where we're looking at how nature is being tackled. Next to Prune we have Jan Gael-Rio from Danone. So Jan is the Global Vice President for Nature and Agricultural at Danone. It's actually a new addition to your past roles that you had. You're also the Chief Executive Officer of the Danone Ecosystem Fund, which has been a long-standing venture as well, where there's already been a lot of investment by Danone at the landscape level with the various suppliers. And we as IUCN had a pleasure also of interacting with the livelihood funds and all these other initiatives that Danone has launched in there. And I'm already going to throw you a question there that you might want to think about and see how you can answer. You had a very charismatic leader with Emmanuel Faber, who's not there anymore at the helm of this company. So how does that change when suddenly you have a CEO like that goes away, but hopefully has left a legacy as well, and still be able to build on? Our next speaker will be also Megan Morikawa. So you're the Global Director of the Sustainability Office at Iberostar Group. You're basically, it's a family-owned luxury hotel with over 120 locations in 19 countries of operations. Probably not as well known as the Accor Group, but a little bit in the same area. But we know that there are a lot of commitments that have been made by Iberostar, very specific, where they've really thought through your impact and your dependencies on nature, and you're going to drive this very forcefully. I've heard some great things about what Iberostar is doing, so hopefully you can share some of this with us. On this panel we also have Dimitri Coudrelier, CEO of the Qantas International Group. And I liked including Qantas in this. IUCN has the privilege to work with Qantas on quite a few projects. Some relate to microplastics and identifying what's the plastic footprint of the companies and how do we help them identifying where they should be focusing on. Or in the food, with the Cool Farming Alliance, where we looked at, how do we actually make sure that people understand what is the consumption of water, land, but all these other elements that are linked to biodiversity on a worldwide basis, and do this on a very interactive map. And that's a recent tool that you developed. And Qantas has this special role of helping this whole system work and this system change to work and measure back on what you're doing. So that's where we felt it was good to have you there as well. I call it a small consultancy. It was a, what is it? How do you call it? A spin-off from the EPFL. That was at Incubator, but you very quickly grew to more than a few hundred, employees now around the world. Another person we have on the charts here was Chris. We'll see if Chris comes. Chris Buss is the director of the Forest Program. The reason why for us it was important to have him is because he is the person that seconded, to Nigel's team as well, and then is part of the COP26. But we always have a plan B at IUCN, and so we'll have resources as well with Julia if there are questions that come more to IUCN on what we're doing in this field and how we would respond to this. So let me first go to you, Prune, if I may. And And I'm just kicking this off, but I really would like this to be a conversation among yourself. I should actually be sitting down and listening to you, because when you're organizing all these events, you're so much in the driving seat that you actually want to sit down and actually have this conversation. So I'm just kicking it off, but you should be bouncing off each other. We actually have plenty of time. That's what we decided to do. We'll do this for a good half an hour, for example, or a little bit more, and then afterwards we'll go to the audience for more additional questions. Okay, so Brune, if I may ask you the standard question that we had prepared for you, but happy for you to answer any way you think to the challenge, is from your point of view, what are the risks and opportunities, and can you give examples of actions, you know, that business in your sector can take, you know, to actually marry the race to zero dialogue, which is very climate focused, to the nature agenda.
So, well, the question, I guess part of the question was the word opportunity, which I would say I thought was kind of strange. I mean, not, we often talk about this as a potential opportunity, but really clearly when you look at the hospitality and tourism sector, it is existential. Nature is at the very heart of the hospitality and tourism sector. I mean, it is obvious, but really what drives prosperity of the sector is its ability to provide an experience to people so that they can actually enjoy the intrinsic value of nature. So clearly, when we talk about biodiversity loss, the hospitality and tourism sector faces an existential risk. Now, once we've said that, and actually when we look at the impact, for example, just to give you an example of the company I work for, Accor. So for those who are not familiar with it, it is the leading European hospitality company. And so if we look at the impact, they're absolutely, obviously huge. Just to give you an example of, for example, one of our key impacts is food, obviously, and I would like to, and I hope we'll have this conversation with Danone. To me, we don't talk enough about biodiversity in the agriculture sector. In the agricultural sector. So this is clearly, and for us, this is where one of our key impact is. Another one is land use. And land use, just to give you a figure, also to give you, I'm not going to dump like thousands of figures on you, but just to give you a broad overview. The land use, the land use that are linked to the land use linked to Accor activities equal 24 times the surface of our hotels. So there you can see the magnitude again of the impact of the footprint of our company. Now, when I say that, when I look at the figures, and this is what I did when I joined the company about a couple of months ago, then you're like, and so what? The reality is, and it is so complicated, and I was actually sitting on the other seat on the side of the government like a few months ago. The problem is that the regulation isn't mature when it comes to biodiversity. Let's face it, it's just like very, very sort of preliminary. First, so as a result, there is no standardized or harmonized methodology to tackle the issue. Third, it is a very, very local issue. And fourth, you cannot address it if you don't take a systemic approach to it, like a whole of the value chain approach to it. So now you're left with, okay, what do I do now? And so I think the way we're probably going to work on that, by the way, with Qantas, and that's what I would really hope so, is, to me, I think the right approach, but again, this is very preliminary, would be to work on the planetary boundaries. Using that framework, you must be all very, very, very familiar about it, like know it well, way better than I do, but you know about the set of 9 planetary boundaries that are actually absolutely critical and that we should not cross if we want humanity to thrive, like today, but also in the future. And to me, this could form the basic of a very, very important framework for companies, because this framework, or the planetary boundaries framework, would take into account CO2 emissions and air pollution. And so this would just be part of the global approach to the issue. So we're going to work along those lines. We want to be the first hospitality company to contribute and to embrace the science-based targets for nature. And what we also want to do, because I think it's critical and it is really part of our responsibility, is develop, and Nigel, I didn't know you were using that expression, but so was I, is really the issue of radical collaboration. It is actually much easier to say than do, but we have to do that. I mean, I see no other way. And finally, one thing also that is going to be absolutely critical for us is guest education. So I don't like the word education because I think we have more to learn about our guests than the other way around. But it would be at least using the fact that, and then in a way, it's a luck, it's a chance to have, it's an opportunity. There I come, and there I can use the word opportunity, to have people stay in our hotels, sometimes spend a few days, and we encourage them. We want them to stay for as long as possible. Then it should be, a hotel should become sort of a new social norm definer, and it should help, and guests should come out with a different experience and a different approach to things. So this was really sort of a broad and a general overview of what we intend to do and how we are going to approach the issue, really putting planetary boundaries at the heart of our strategy rather than focusing mostly on carbon. And now I'm sure the other panelists will have even more concrete things to say as we are about to launch, and we're still working on the strategy for the company. So now, who would you like me to pass on the...
Trying to respect COVID.
Thank you. So back to your question, starting with risk and opportunities. Danone is a food company, so we work with nature. Our living and existence comes from our relation with nature and comes with our relation with our farmers. So the risks are obvious. The risks are what you hear in the IUCN conference day in, day out. This is about risk of supply, continuity of business, rising costs, you name it. And I think it's shared by any business or body working with nature and agriculture. Interestingly, opportunities are developing, and I can think of first, the increasing convergence between environmental performance and financial performance when it comes to cost, to P&L management, to some extent when it comes to consumer demand also. So I said we are working with nature. This is about Race to Zero, so this is about climate to a large extent. 60% of Danone footprint, Danone CO2 footprint comes from agriculture. So when we reflect on our Race to Zero and how do we improve our footprint, it starts with agriculture. We're working with 400,000 farmers, 60,000 of them directly, where we have direct relationship. So the key, it all starts at the farm level and how we partner with farmers. And 400,000 farmers, and I'm sure Qantas is heavily invested in this, is first a complication. Where are they? What do they do? How do you measure what they do today? How do you track what they will do tomorrow? And how you track what the way you improve? At Danone, we have embraced the concept of regenerative agriculture back in 2017. And our framework of action is structured around this. So how do we engage farmers? How do we partner with them? We have a three-ways approach. First, we need to design and define the new solutions. What is the new farming model which is going to respect and embrace the regenerative agriculture framework? And of course, it's different if you are producing milk, if you are producing soy, strawberries, and palm. Again, within this, it's different whether you are farming in Europe, in US, in Brazil, or Africa. So you need to design the solutions which work for various models and are tailor-made for the various farming models. So one is the solution. The second one is around the financing, and you mentioned it. So we're not about trillions at Danone, unfortunately. We are a bit more modest. And when we talk financing, it's not only about how much more you pay to farmer. It's not only about premiums. It's also how you build a context where the farmer have visibility over time, long-term contract, long-term visibility. So they know that when they engage in a transformation, they will have the safety of the business relationship with someone, Danone in that case, who is going to care about the new value, the new natural value of what they produce. And the last pillar of the transformation is around change management. So you have 400,000 farmers. They are all different. They all look at this differently. They all are more or less innovative. They all more or less trust Danone or the large food companies. So their ability to engage in a change of farming system is very different. So we focus a lot on how we convert them, we engage them in transitioning to organic agriculture, and that's everyday effort. And we work with farmers' communities because what we believe in farming is seeing is believing. So how do you show evidence on the ground that the new model does change? So we've got these three pillars when we look at farming and partnering with farmers. But it's not sufficient. This is about our own supply chain. But there is, we don't own entirely our own supply chain. Some other food companies are also playing a role in that same supply chain. So you mentioned radical collaboration. You mentioned harmonized, methodologies. This is the next level of partnering. So how do we partner with our peers? How do we partner with the public authorities? So interestingly, just before that session did start, the OP2B coalition, so the One Planet Business for Biodiversity coalition, just released a framework of action for regenerative agriculture. So we are a founding member of OP2B. Nestle, Unilever, many other large companies are part of it. This is one step in that direction. How do you harmonize methodology and how do you foster radical collaboration? That's more of a business partnership. We also need to partner with public organizations. And earlier today, in the name of Danone, I had the pleasure to sign the extension of the partnership we have with the Ramsar Convention, so the Conventions for Wetland Protection. It's a partnership we started in '98, and wetlands back in '98 was mostly around water and water quality. Today, it's really about nature-based solution. It's about water, it's about biodiversity, it's about how does it positively impact climate and fosters the resilience of the ecosystem. So this is another example of partnership. And I'm just going to close with this. The partnership started in '98. And one of the biggest challenge in all of what we're discussing today is consistency over time. This change takes time. It takes money, yes, but it also takes time and consistency.
So I'm going to hand over to Megan from Iberostar, but thank you. You've clearly highlighted the importance of partnership, the long-term engagements in there, and then really highlighting that in the end, you're really having the contact back to the farmers, because that's where the change needs to happen. And that's where the trillions are going to come from in the end on the ground. Like you, Prun, also said, hey, you've got a footprint which is 24 times what actually your footprint represents. And you've actually identified also where these risks and these dependencies are. All these tools that I know that some people here in the audience have been contributed and developed over time. But Megan, how are you reacting it? Is it different than what Danone and Accor are doing? And there might be similarities, of course, because of Iberostar. But also perhaps tell us, because that's really the opportunity, very concrete actions that you have developed, because that's all what we want to learn from.
Well, thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here having this conversation, and I am very much looking forward to that conversation. And I think I'll start giving you a bit of information about who we are, because I do recognize. So Iberostar is a Spanish-based, family-owned luxury tourism group. We have 120 properties in 19 countries around the world, 34,000 employees, and most importantly, a strong commitment to the oceans, in part because 80% of our hotels are coastal, but in other part because we are a family-run business, and the third and fourth generation have always had a strong commitment to being guests in our destinations, and those values embedded in generations of this business allowed us to very quickly turn that into a strong commitment for the environment through our Wave of Change movement. We're honored to have not only the family directly involved in all of decision-making processes, but Gloria Flusha is our Chief Sustainability Officer as well, who allows us to be able to ensure that we really have a top-down and bottom-up approach into what it is that we're doing with our movement. But in 2017 was when a lot of these objectives became a reality in a quantitative and time-bound sort of way, which we call our Wave of Change movement, which has a commitment to the ocean that we work on 3 pillars: commitment to a circular economy, to the responsible consumption of seafood, and to coastal health. And I think I'm going to really lean into this race analogy and start with where to start, right? I think this was a really important component for us, because now we have these very clear, ambitious, quantitative, aligned goals. But it can be often hard to start in that sort of position, and that one of the recommendations that we give frequently is that you just need to, progress over perfection in many instances, and just to begin with some traction point for you to understand how this is fit within the business context is one of the most important lessons that we can kind of bring away from this example. For us at Iberostar, it was looking at how we could remove all single-use plastics from our operations, and I love that was our starting point, because it was incredibly ambitious for us to remove all single-use plastics from all of the properties that we had around the world, which we actually achieved last year. But it was an entry point into talking more holistically about circular economy and our consumption practices and what waste management could actually deal with in the destinations where we were working. Or another way that we started was to see whether or not we could work on helping coral reefs in the Dominican Republic, which very quickly turned into a commitment to coastal health and looking at restorative and regenerative practices that we could implement in any of these destinations. So I think what is important is just starting is one of the most important lessons that we learned, because the holistic strategy came after we were figuring out how it fit into our business context. Then it's how you run the race, right? And we'll get to that in a moment. But I think what is also important is knowing where the finish line is. We have a global finish line of 2050, not net zero in terms of CO2 equivalent emissions into the atmosphere. But that probably should not be the finishing line for businesses that are leading this sort of sector. And so this is where I think time-bound quantitative goals are absolutely fundamental once this strategy starts to get implemented. And this is where we created our what we call our 5 long-term commitments to 2030, born from those pillars, but now quantified and science-based. And this is our first objective is that we remove all single-use plastics from our operations, which we achieved last year, to send no waste to landfill across our operations by 2025, to reach carbon neutrality by 2030, and importantly, doing that work by decarbonizing the business as much as possible. We as an accommodation provider have many ways in which we can work on energy efficiency, on electrification, on encouraging renewable energies to come to the destinations where we're working if those renewable energies are not present, and that's a major component of that. However, recognizing how tourism and accommodation providers are, as well as the ambition of the finish line of 2030, in that objective, we also have to have compensation as a part of this. And so this is something I'm excited to get into as well, and that we also committed to any remaining carbon footprint that we have by 2030. We will offset at least 3/4 of that by protecting and restoring nature in our destinations. And so this is another kind of interesting and important component. Our second objective, to source 100% responsible seafood across all of our operations by 2025. That might sound simple, but once you enter into the world of sustainable seafood and blue food, you realize just how complex a goal like that may be. The third objective, which is where this is about how you run the race, needs to be scientifically driven, is that all ecosystems, or all of the nature that surrounds our properties, are in improving ecological health alongside profitable tourism in the places we work by 2030. The fourth objective objective is about clients choosing Iberostar because of this work. The fifth about how we can do pre-competitive collaboration across the sector. And so I'm very excited, Brune, to be continuing talking on many of these areas. But I think this brings us to how you run the race, right? So here's the finish line. That's how you start and how you run the race. And what is most important and interesting, I would precipitate into two comments. The first is that none of this work is going to be able to happen without being science-driven and quantitative. And that is very challenging for many businesses to be able to do, because there are many metrics that we have well measured. How much energy we're purchasing in kilowatt hours. That's easy for us to get to. How much waste are we producing? What are the baseline drivers or what is the baseline health of the ecosystem in the places where we're operating? These are very challenging things that we need to be able to integrate. But you need to have a science-driven approach, which is where public-private sector partnerships, as well as within Iberostar, the need to actually recognize that you can't have just a couple of individuals realizing this strategy across an entire organization. You need this to be both expertise in-house and decision-making that's integrated from the executive committee down to every individual who is in our housekeeping staff who helps us to be able to achieve our goals of sending no waste to landfill. So the science-driven approach is a really critical component of it. But the last component that I would say is once you're able to start and reach these time-bound quantitative goals, taking a holistic approach to this conservation actually is to these objectives actually can provide some surprising win-wins, not only for nature and climate, but also for our business. And I take this example because I know it is often talked about, especially at the IUCN conference, that is climate at odds with the protection of biodiversity and nature, right? But when we as a tourism business are so dependent on the resiliency of these sorts of destinations and had an objective that all ecosystems are in improving ecological health alongside profitable tourism, we realized that there was a way to link the compensation with the regeneration of nature in these destinations, which also gives back to societal challenges that entire communities face at scale. And so when we're looking to do things like help to establish new protected areas, for example, in Jamaica, we're working with the local fishing community that's next to our hotel to establish a new marine sanctuary, a no-take zone in front of the property that we have in Jamaica, or looking to engage with government on helping to co-manage protected areas. This gives us an opportunity to work on climate and to work on nature-based solutions at the same time. When you have this holistic view, as well as bringing in the circular economy component, where do these products come from? Restorative and regenerative agriculture that each of our providers are having within this context also links us to being able to quantify better our Scope 3 emissions and reduce our total carbon footprint in that sense as well. And so when you actually take this holistic approach, we find that there are sort of these win-win opportunities to have synergistic solutions that help not only the business's bottom line, but also the destinations where we're operating.
Thank you very much, Megan. And I love the fact that you highlighted all these co-benefits and actually showing that, this is by adding the nature agenda to this, there's so many more opportunities, more linkages in the whole holistic approaching. And I'm sure Nigel is going to think now through his head on how do I now do this? How can we demonstrate this in Glasgow as well? How do we organize? I know you're working hard on it, on the agenda. What are the various pillars that should be shown there? I've got some water for you because I know it's so hot out here. So can I pass these out or not?
Sorry.
You want to react? That's fine.
May I just be rude? Since this is a conversation, I was just wondering. So it was great to hear from actually all of you. Just a question. So you mentioned you're going to be working with. It's just working on. I mean, it's what you said that made me think of it. One of the things that we're currently exploring, but it's very, very at the initial stage, is actually working with insurance companies on, for example, if we help restore nature and make sure that they can, provide the services that they're actually were provided before we destroyed it or before being about to destroy it, we can actually get, a different. Sorry, I'm lacking the word in English, but anyway, it's like a new way of working with insurance companies. And so I was just wondering whether this is also part of I'm guessing you work with a lot of insurance companies, but this could be one of the solutions. And I'm sure that if in some areas we both have hotels in the same area, we can join forces. And this is typically one of the things that we can do, because we know that in a few years, hotel and places won't be insurable, most probably, at least in a lot of areas. Anyway, off the top of my mind, I hope you don't mind.
That's good, and let's the conversation going. It's your time. But Dimitri, also from a Qantas perspective, I mean, you've been quoted by every single one on saying, "Hey, that's where we need the help of Qantas." So perhaps explain a little bit for the people that might not know your outfit exactly, and then what the opportunities and also risks you see.
Basically, the four of you made my day because you introduced perfectly what we are trying to do at Qantas. We are trying to jungle between three key topics: the planetary boundary, science, and businesses. So I had the pleasure to be at Qantas for more than 15 years in the beginning of the company. And at the beginning, when we are trying to speak about this planetary boundaries framework for companies, when we are trying to tell them you need to take into account science in your commitment towards sustainability, it was super complicated. But we are absolutely convinced that the good framework for the commitment of companies on environmental issue is the planetary boundaries, and you need to listen to science about what do they say on this topic. IPCC is doing that very well. IPBS is doing that very well. We have a lot of conference there, a lot of scientific and academic partners are there, and they are showing the way. Basically at Qantas we are, and it's not easy every day, we are trying to conceal the three in order to support companies toward their transformation. We were 15 at the beginning, we are almost 300 now, growing super rapidly between Europe and the US. And for example, we are supporting WWF on their framework around land use, land transformation, and biodiversity with its planetary boundaries highly. We are supporting food companies toward the 1.5 and net zero strategy. We are trying to support different product stewardship for the cosmetics, for the food, for the textile industry in order to see how they can work pre-competitively all together. So maybe I can give you two hands on the way we see the issue of biodiversity. 70% of the requests that we have are still related to climate. Biodiversity it was like 5% 5 years ago, but it's still dominated by climate change. And on biodiversity, we have two main things that we are trying to work. One is how to understand what biodiversity means for you. And at this stage, most of the companies, they see action on biodiversity based on a sum of different actions that they could have at the local level. Basically, it's their biodiversity strategy, which is the sum of the actions. But when we look to the full value chain, we can see that maybe those actions could represent like 10 or 15% of the impact of biodiversity. So please have a look to your full value chain first in order to understand where are really your biodiversity issue. There is plenty of tools for that. There is a life cycle assessment, there is export, there is lots of tools that help you with even few data to understand where do you have the big hotspot on your full value chain on biodiversity. Then when it's done, you can go a step further and you can work on risk assessment, you can work on traceability. You can try to understand where you have the biggest hotspot, where you can have more specific data, try to engage your suppliers because it's going to be mainly on your value chain. So how can I get more information, more accurate information by having my supplier with me? And then it's really a matter of changing the type of governance, obviously, that you have with your supply chain. You can't do it on biodiversity without taking your supplier with you in clear action plan, in pre-competitive approach. It's not only your suppliers, it can be your suppliers and your competitors. And we can see a lot of pre-competitive initiatives that are coming everywhere on climate. A few are now coming on biodiversity, but that's going to be the future for all of you. It's to work with a pre-competitive and collaborative approach. When it's done, you have a clear understanding of your impact. You can go to see what is the finish line. So what is the type of commitment do I need to take on that? Just, it's better when it's said, on planetary boundaries, when you look to biodiversity, we have overpassed the boundaries of the planet on biodiversity. So if you have only commitment related to reduction, you are missing something. You need to have restoration, you need to have conservation. That's absolutely obvious. You cannot only try to reduce. The boundaries has been crossed. It's not the case for climate. The boundaries, the world is very close, but the boundary is not crossed. So it's another approach. That's why the framework of the nature positive makes a lot of sense, because it's reducing plus trying to restore, trying to do some conservation within your value chain. When it's done, and it's one of the other difference with climate, is that you have to have global commitment, but you have to have local actions. It means that you have to see, and we have a lot of clients that are trying to do that for the derivative of palm oils. How can I work with my competitors, with the food and ag industry, in order to shape new standard with farmers on the field? So I need to change the way I embark my stakeholders. And when I have a very complex value chain, where I can have like 10 actors between the land and me, I need to better understand and have a better traceability of how I can engage all of these people. And then the last point, it's to be consistent with your climate goal, meaning that we can see still a lot of climate commitment that can be challengeable in terms of biodiversity. So what we are trying to do, it's ready to have the waste for zero for climate, but please have a waste to zero for climate and biodiversity. And biodiversity can be, and you can go to waste for zero or waste for positive. So how can I have a climate biodiversity strategy? And I was speaking with one of the company here a few minutes ago, and they were telling me we have a climate roadmap, super clear. We have a climate governance, and we have another team with a biodiversity. And I was just trying to challenge her a little bit by saying, okay, but do you have like an advisory board that mix the two? No, we speak together. But I think at the right beginning, just to shape the priority, to shape how you want to put the resource, try to have climate and biodiversity people involved in the same room in order at least to shape the coming 3 years. So waste for zero on climate make a lot of sense. Ways to be positive on biodiversity is absolutely crucial. And we have the chance for COP26 to launch a project which is Generation Glasgow. The goal of this project is to interview the most, between the most influential CEO over the world. We have Mars, we have Chanel, we have Schneider Electric, we have Danone, we have many of them. And the goal is to try to see where are the biggest blocking points that they have, where are the biggest barriers that they have in order to drive the action. The time for commitment is absolutely crucial, but now comes the time for action, action, action. And of course, we can see that there is a lot of blocking chain. I don't want to repeat the story about Paul Mann, about Emmanuel Faber, about Isabelle Cocher. We have difficulties, we have barriers to face in order to put these bold actions. And the goal of this interview is to understand, with a confidentiality statement, how they see the main blocking point that we can have, and how can we make some proposal, not us, not Quentis, but the ecosystem, in order to move towards this blocking points or barrier they could have. So I think anyway, if it's the case of climate or if it's a case of biodiversity, there is really the time for action that needs to go now and before 2025.
I just want to pick up it's very exciting to see how much commonality there is actually in the way. One thing that seems to me is that we're all very clear on its importance to be science-led. And we founded the Science Based Targets Initiative on climate in 2014, and I think now there's nearly 2,000 companies with sort of 20% of the world economy setting science-based targets. It's an incredible success. And two things I think that have been key to that. One is that it was founded collaboratively. It was CDP, WWF, WRI, Women Business, the Global Compact. We're starting to learn how to do that much better, but back then that was really unusual. The normal thing would have been to have 5 competing initiatives, and by now they'd all have 40 members, but they wouldn't have reached the kind of critical mass where they start to be used elsewhere. Gonzalo tells me a lovely story. When we launched the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and we said, you as an asset owner or as an asset manager or as a bank, you have to commit to the race to zero, commit to net zero to be in this alliance. And one of the biggest pension funds in North America, the Ontario Teachers, they joined the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. The day after they joined, Gonzalo, who's based in Chile, started getting phone calls from CEOs of Latin American companies saying, we've just had an email from one of our major shareholders saying we've got to set a science-based target. We've got no idea how to start. So this, when it starts to become systemic, right? So that it's not just NGOs and who often have to lead the way in creating new standards, but it starts to be regulators and markets. So I think, and a lot of the work of the NGO community is in translating the Earth system science into applicable methodologies that businesses can use. So it's really exciting to hear Bruno talk about the science-based targets NEB, because when we launched that like 4 years ago, the idea was maybe we could learn from the success of the science-based targets for climate and apply it to the more complex in many ways because they're local, as you all say. So I think this point of following the science and translation, also the full value chain, really important that every business has a very different value chain, and really important that people understand where the leverage for change and where the hotspots are. I'm also really so pleased to hear about radical collaboration. I think that in my lifetime we've been seduced by an excessive narrative, a sort of Darwinian narrative that it's all about competition. If to win you've got to compete and everything else is for losers. And actually we know scientifically, experientially, that it's all about collaboration and competition. And interestingly, some of the most competitive and successful sectors with the most dynamic rate of change are much more aware of the importance of collaboration than some older sectors. So the tech industry, they know how to do pre-competitive collaboration. Everybody here is familiar with the idea of 3G, 4G, 5G. That sector's already defined 6G and is working to develop it. And they're working on the definition of 7G. But they're as competitive as hell. Right, so it's perfectly possible to be very collaborative and very competitive. I'm sure Accor and Iberostar, can be very collaborative on many of these issues and be really competitive about attracting clients. We just need to look. That's kind of normal life, right? We compete and collaborate all the time. I also I love the framing of I also love the fact that Jan's job title is agricultural procurement and sustainability. That seems to me a kind of symbol of this sort of pragmatism that several people have talked about of sustainability is not separate from running the business, right? If you're running a food business, it is the job of procurement to figure out how to do that in a sustainable way. So I think that's really exciting. And the last thing I think is this is about systems change, right? It's not about one actor fixing it. It's not the most powerful actor in the value chain. It's not just the investors. It's not just policymakers. It's not just farmers. Everybody's going to have to shift in every one of these systems, and we have to, I think, be a bit more humble about the fact that nobody can do it on their own. And so not only do we need collaboration amongst competitors, we also need to recognise that all sorts of different levers are needed. And my last point I want to make on your point on insurance, I think that's a really good illustration. Insurers are systems players, right? They exist to spread and share risk. I was visiting some of the small island states recently. There's some really exciting innovations in insurance. They call it parametric insurance, where instead of the normal, if you're in a small island community and you get hit by a hurricane, you can't afford 6 months arguing with a loss adjuster, which is the person from insurance head office, to talk about how much you can claim. You need money right immediately. So this idea of parametric insurance, where the insurance payout is linked to a measurable event. So as soon as the wind speeds hit a certain level, then the money starts to flow directly, which means it actually increases resilience directly because it starts to provide resources very quickly. So I think insurance is turning out to be a very key actor in many of these resilience initiatives in particular.
Thank you, Nigel, and thank you for the first. But the conversation continues. What I'm actually asking is perhaps Julia to come in from UCN, because we've actually done a lot of these collaborations, and we have some sectors that are actually not even here in this room, like the infrastructure or the energy sector. So we wanted to give also, as a science-based organization, which has the knowledge and a lot of the data on how we tackling it. So Julia, as having been in a business and biodiversity program for so many years, how would you react to this?
Yeah, thank you, Gerard. And I'm also standing a bit for for Chris, who is not here, but also taking the opportunity of talking about collaboration from a conservation perspective. You know, if you look at the IUCN program Nature 2030, which is a program for the entire conservation community membership of IUCN, 1,400, has a clear call for climate in nature. So we have two pillars. One is about restoration, using nature-based solutions for restoration. One is using nature-based solutions for mitigation. And then the third one is about looking at the potential impacts that solutions for climate might bring on biodiversity. So, and I think this is really a clear call that is, you know, diversified, looks at the opportunities, which is really strong about, you know, the opportunities between climate and nature. And I love what you said, Nigel, at the beginning. These two agendas have to come together because it's synergies, it's resources, it's, you know, common goals, but also looking at the risk. And I think that's also an important part that we need to be, you know, conscious about, because there are a number of sectors that are picking up to respond to the race to zero. I mean, recently we have done some really important work on renewable energy and biodiversity with some energy companies. We hope to expand that. Looking at what are the biodiversity impacts. And this is not to say we should not have renewable energy, which is going to be the solution for tomorrow, our energy solutions, but it's really about let's do it well, perfectly well from the beginning. And, you know, making sure that that doesn't become an obstacle to the race to zero. On nature-based solutions, we have a standard that is also there to make sure that we deploy these nature-based solutions in a way that is high quality, and it will actually generate not only the results, the outcomes for climate, but also positive outcome for nature. And this is the win-win. And I think this is really the first time we can really see the win-win for nature and climate. So I'm really you know, the IUCN program Nature 30 is really capturing this in a very clear, concise way. And we hope that it's not just the, you know, 3 objectives, but also 1,400 members coming together and really, you know, working with businesses and making sure that we all work on this area. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, so now we go to the second phase where we're going to ask the audience a little bit, unless you want to challenge each other, because what you did there, Prune, was great. I mean, that's also the synergies that we want to see. Megan, you want to. That's great. Do, please.
I think this is a great question. The question was about whether or not insurance can play a role in rewarding effectively work that's being done to help build resiliency in the face of things like extreme weather events, right? This is something I would be very curious to continue discussing. I think that ultimately the size and scale of the insurance companies, what we're seeing right now is a lot of parametric insurance for public properties, right? But how does that actually move to the physical building itself? Is there enough data and evidence? Because you also know that you cannot talk to an insurance company unless you have case studies on case studies on case studies to begin to have this sort of conversation. So that's a really interesting one. But to flip that around, which is another side of it, is to say, if you're actually gaining these ecosystem services, for example, many of our properties are in the Caribbean Basin, and we have an initiative to restore and protect the reefs that are directly in front of our properties. Of the properties we have in the Caribbean, we have about 5.6 square kilometers of reef providing ecosystem services directly to these properties. It's one of the reasons why, as well, in terms of the other forms in which we're working to engage the sector at large, we launched the Tourism Action Coalition for a Sustainable Ocean, and TAXO is utilizing IUCN's nature-based solution standards as a way to be able to standardize and benchmark any of the solutions that we're implementing in these sorts of settings. But with all of that framework and standardization in mind, you should theoretically be able to see less damage on your resorts when you implement that, and you might need to actually demonstrate that to the insurers before they reduce your insurance premium in many of these instances, and or at least demonstrate that the work that you're doing is in some way. It comes down to wave height, right? It comes down to your ability to demonstrate that the wave energy is being dissipated because of your actions in these sorts of regions. So it might actually even almost need to go in the opposite to really demonstrate this proof case analysis. But I think importantly as well, as we which is I'm sure a commonality in all of our destinations, if Iberostar is restoring the reefs right in front of our properties, that's not going to do a lot in terms of the Mesoamerican reef at large, for example, in the Yucatan Peninsula. And in that sense, it's going to need to be something that can then be collectively taken on by multiple players in both private and public sector. And we still need to work through a lot of the weedy discussions about financing, about how it is, whether or not the technology is even present, right? Because I think one of the challenges, I actually did my PhD at Stanford's Marine Station on how we could restore coral reefs that were more resilient to climate change. And we don't have a lot of answers that we need currently in the work that we need to implement a lot of those solutions from the scientific field. So I think all of this is incredibly relevant for us to consider.
And I think this is a good example where public-private collaboration is really important, right? Because, I used to run factories, right? And you're used to the insurance inspector coming to look at what fire prevention measures you've got in place and your premium depending on that. But as you say, when we're talking at kind of ecosystem level risks, there'll be something you can do locally on your own resort, but actually governments do this kind of thing all the time. And we know in the UK, the government is a sort of insurer of last resort for flood risk. And of course, in the Caribbean, if you have a hurricane, then the government is the insurer of last resort. So there should be ways of public, and actually, particularly in those regions where tourism is one of the major property owners and employers and GDP generators, there should be a really strong case for the insurance sector in some of these communities to really engage with the public sector to say, hey, if we work together, we can reduce the overall economic fragility, not just of individual resorts, but of whole countries, right? Yeah.
I'd like to offer.
Why don't we work on a collaboration either towards COP26 or COP15? I think, we have the right number of people to work on insurance, biodiversity, tourism. I don't know. I'm just throwing an idea.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Right, that's three yeses. Let's do it.
And that works already.
I think too, right? We started an initiative with Expedia, who's incredibly interested in the Mesoamerican reef, and Iberostar and Expedia have already started this work in the region along with Taxo. So there's a vehicle that exists for us to be able to do exactly this work, and that would be great for us to join all of those ideas into that reality.
Just want to offer an illustration, not in the insurance sector, but in the financing sector. Danone 2 years ago syndicated a bond, a €2 billion bond, which the interest rate is indexed on our carbon footprint. So if we reach a number of threshold in our carbon footprint reduction, the rate of the bond is going down. And this was the first of its kind back then, but this is really developing. And I think, this is happening in financing. I'm sure this is going to happen in insurance. And these are type of initiatives which are going to really to accelerate the transformation. The awareness is there; it was not before. Really, what this technical or science-based solution, we need science-based target, but we need science-based solution. They are developing, not fully there. But if we crack on top of this the financing mechanism, then we can really face a positive systemic change.
And just another example that goes in the same direction, we are trying to push the extra financial rating agency to better tackle biodiversity with a risk or impact assessment approach. So we have met all of them since 2015. Everywhere we are trying to have a project with them, and we succeed a few months ago to have with one of the biggest a big project in order for them to assess that. And the reason why they accept, obviously, is because they receive a lot of pressure on that. They want to have much more quantitative data on all of that about risk assessment, about impact. So we are going for a project of more than 1 year with them. And we can see the pressure, and we can see the type of question that is raised by this community has completely changed. So obviously on climate on the last 5 years, but even on biodiversity on the last 1 year and a half. And COVID is unfortunately a little bit supporting that, because there was a topic about traceability, about better understanding my value chain, and we need to de-risk. We need to put out the risk about all of this issue.
Megan, I saw you took the microphone, but I also want to think a little bit about our public here. That you've been very silently listening to all this, but I'm sure there might be some burning questions that you have on this great discussion. So I see Denis at the back, then Martin, and then we'll go there. So we'll have these wives trying to clean them the best we can. So Denis from L'Occitane.
All right. Sorry, I come in front.
And who is the question to?
Thank you. It's for both maybe Dimitri and Nigel. My question is, I'm not talking about on behalf of L'Occitane for this time, but more for small or middle-sized company, because science-based target is a quite difficult framework. We are learning now how it works. And even for a company like L'Occitane, it's quite challenging to gather data, to understand really the technicalities. It's something that is absolutely new. So how we are engaged small companies, middle-sized company, because it's complex, even more complex for them. Sometimes they don't have just the time, and the resource. They don't even know that quantities exist. So how we can engage those companies? Because if we want to reach this change at scale and very fast, we also need to work with a lot of different kind of company, and not only the big ones that are here today. And of course, we are very happy to be part of those companies that are trying to run the race at the front. Thank you.
So maybe to answer the first one, it's I think we have all a role to play on the good enough, meaning that there is obviously all companies have sustainability goals, but is it good enough, the level of transformation that they are looking for? And I mean, for big, middle-sized, small company, we need to question and we need to be able to convince that it's not a matter of doing slightly better, it's a matter of doing enough regarding the planetary boundaries framework. So I really try to push as much as possible, depending on the size of the company, to convince everybody around the table around that first. Secondly, the answer would have been like 5 years ago, mainly impossible. Without resources, without time, impossible. We don't have data, we didn't have methodology, we didn't have the tools. It was super complicated to take over biodiversity. And it was the case 15 years ago for climate. Doing a corporate footprint, a climate footprint on my full value chain, it was super complex because we didn't have the data and everything. Same for biodiversity, but now we have, I would say, on the last 5 years, developed like 100 more information that we have developed over the last 20 years. So we have a lot of data, a lot of methodologies that can. We have a lot of free tools just in order to see where are your hotspots. So I mean, like by having like 2 weeks of work, just having a look to your value chain, just doing a mapping of your risk of your hotspot is absolutely feasible for any companies.
Yeah, I mean, really good question. I think a lot of big companies, well, all big companies have lots of SMEs in their supply chain, right? And because a lot of emissions are in the supply chain, we have, nearly every company in the Race to Zero is also engaging with suppliers and asking them to join the Race to Zero to set science-based targets. So, and I completely agree with Dimitri that a few years ago it was pretty much impossible, and even now the complexity of the science-based targets methodologies, which are really designed for larger companies, is a barrier. So there's a collaboration between We Mean Business, the International Chamber of Commerce, and the Exponential Roadmap team who've created the Sme Climate Hub. So and the whole idea of that is much simpler route into the Race to Zero and a lot of tools that are freely available for SMEs. So anybody who's trying to engage with their small and medium-sized suppliers, I would point them in the direction of the SME Climate. If you just Google SME Climate Hub, you should find it, or via We Mean Business.
You are speaking exactly about what I was going to comment on, which is that a lot of these large businesses are directly connected to SMEs in their supply chain, and I think that's incredibly relevant, whether it be looking to have them commit their own SBTIs because of the emissions target that the primary company has itself, or, for example, we've gone down this pathway with our seafood traceability work. In order to have responsible seafood, we need to have full traceability across the supply chain from the boat all the way to consumption, and whether it be saying, hey, look, if you want to, you can get a chain of custody certification with MSc and go through this process to understand what all of the factors are in this as well. But even if that wasn't feasible, we're still sitting there saying, here, we have resources available to talk to you about how we want these products to be coming to us in order for us to continue doing business with you in some cases. So that's one component. But another component, which I think is also incredibly relevant as well, is building simple, digestible flowcharts and toolkits, right, that a business can paste on their wall above their waste bin to understand how to reach circular economy, that are synthesized from these really important large documents, right? I think what's also incredibly important to recognize is that it often is very challenging to synthesize complex information into very simple protocols that might be able to be used immediately to work and interact with employers. And so all of those tools are tools that are incredibly helpful. At Iberostar as well, and I think what's also very important is that this information, if we really want fast engagement, needs to be freely available, right? And not necessarily within consultancies in many instances for some of the simple stuff, like how do you segregate your waste more properly? This is one of the reasons why Iberostar has been very passionate about publishing our roadmaps for each of these goals and what are the sub-targets that we're setting every single year in order to get to these goals. How did we do in performance relative to those targets? How are we defining single-use plastics free? How is it defined by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation? How is it defined by others for in this process? But what I also think is incredible, and there's a great example from Accor as well, when you guys were working on the ways to respond to the health crisis, you guys created a protocol that was reasonably available for people to be able to see, and I'm sure that was incredibly helpful for other SMEs to understand how to use that sort of work. We did similar work with our health and safety protocol, working with the World Health Organization to see how you could respond to the pandemic while also not increasing the consumption of plastics in the process. But those sorts of things, like I challenge us to also think beyond just our sustainability reports and seeing ways in which we can start to publish some of the protocols and how we've engaged with our individual hotels. And the last component that I would say, and maybe pass this to you, Brun, because I think the way, once you get to a certain size, particularly in the accommodation providers, many of the franchises themselves are in fact conglomerates of SMEs underneath a single brand, right? And so you guys actually have a lot of experience in being able to understand how to communicate to each of these individual enterprises. And if those recommendations that align with the global corporate policies are things that can also be made as toolkits for an SME to take on, that's also an incredible toolkit.
Yeah, Megan, I completely agree with your last comment, and that's actually where I wanted to jump in. Very large multinationals are actually a succession of a lot of individual businesses that sometimes are really entrepreneurs, very small businesses, and so basically they can also be the conduit and the driver of change. Next hands that we had up was the lady at the back. If you quickly, but there was Martin Locke also. So ladies go first. So if you come up here, because then the viewers
but I have the
online
mic.
can also show you. But you have the mic. But I'll ask the lady to come up, okay? But perhaps for the viewers, they can see you then.
Sorry? I get different signals. I start talking. I have the mic. So sorry about that. You go second. It's really a great panel. Thank you for all of the information that you bring to the table. My name is Martin Locke, by the way. I'm the Executive Director of the Capitals Coalition. You were talking about the need to have standardized guidance, easy to use tools. This is our business. So we are in that business. We are a global collaboration. 400 organizations worldwide. We have protocols, guidance, documents, etc. I don't want to talk about that. But I want to give the message that we shouldn't wait for standardization. It's not fully standardized yet. Yes, it needs to be improved, but it's good enough to go ahead. And it's the reason why we are not implementing it is not that it's not good enough. The reason is there's no consequence. So you implement it. For example, I presented on another panel earlier today. There's a marine protected area in Mallorca, not too far from here. They did a natural capital account, and clear conclusion, every euro spent in this marine protected areas generates 10 euros. So there's a big business case, but the guy or the girl spending the euro is not getting the return back. So I think we have to look to the consequences of having filled in all these kind of assessments. So finance and the insurance company is already a good one. We have a couple of our partners like BNP Paribas. They are already giving cheaper loans. I make it probably a little bit too easy for them, but that's what they are doing. They are giving an advantage, or they are punishing if you're not doing the right things. So that's there. And that needs further collaboration. But there's also a need to pay. And I mean, I worked for the Dutch government years ago. One thing we try to do is to have a discussion with the organizations like the businesses like you, just to bring money from the beer that we sold, that you sold, to the people managing the natural capital, because you have to create kind of a direct revenue stream. And so what I wonder, and I love the concept of radical collaboration, and who hasn't watched Nigel's TED Talk, please do, it's brilliant. But I get the idea that you're talking about radical collaboration between companies in one sector. I want radical collaboration between companies, policymakers that can change taxes, for example, or that can say you have to pay more money for resource use, with the financial sector that then says, but if you're doing that, you can get a cheaper loan or a cheaper insurance. So how can we get that type of radical collaboration going? That would be my question, probably to all of you, but also to the finance people and the governments that are not here.
So first, traditionally you have pre-competitive alliance within sector, and that has been working for many years now. What you see developing is pre-competitive alliance across sectors. I mentioned OP2B. Occitan is a member of OP2B. They are in the. You also have Kirin from the luxury industry, as well as a number of food companies, etc. So, and this is probably the beginning of a broader collaboration. Now, what's getting difficult is how do you extend a business collaboration structure to the public sector, and that's something which is difficult because the public sector is, not unified itself. You've got Europe, but beyond Europe, you have the structure of collaboration is not existing except for the COP, which is the exact intent of it. Is it working well or not? We can debate, but that's another conversation. So I would say it's a fair challenge, but I find it. I'm a believer in a step-by-step approach. So let's make sure that I'm from the business sector. Let's make sure that the cross-sector business collaboration is working before trying to crack everything at the same time. And Nigel has the same challenge: how we will make the cross public sector collaboration work, and then we'll see how the two will meet. But the day you've got a clear incentive mechanism that the cost of water, cost of carbon, cost of biodiversity is clearly incentivized by the public sector, there will not be a need for strong collaboration between public sector and private sector. Business will adapt.
Well, no, go ahead.
I think that's. I feel quite strongly that we are emerging from what will historically be judged as an era of atomization and selfishness, which dismissed the importance of collaboration. So we're having to relearn how to do it in many ways. Right? It's always been there, as actually. I think about it. You think if you're running procurement, right? I used to run procurement in a industrial manufacturing company. You have all sorts of collaboration that you rely on with your suppliers, like engineer to engineer relationships that make things work, that solve problems when they pop up. It's not a brutal competitive work where everybody only works by the letter of the contract, and that's just one example. So many examples. We have a form of industrial action in the UK that we call working to rule. In other words, the labour force can disrupt a business by only doing what they're supposed to do contractually, which proves that most of the time they're collaborating way beyond what they're contractually supposed to do. So that's the first thought. I think one of the key things is that a lot of the business collaborations are, I would call, defensive. So they're about protecting the interests of the business. They're not about mission-driven collaboration. So when we start talking about OP2B or getting to zero in the shipping industry is really interesting. These are collaborations with the specific intent to bring about systems transformations. That's the first thing. If you've only got trade bodies, it's very hard to get this kind of collaboration. You kind of have to break away from the lowest common denominator problem of trade bodies. Sometimes that changes, like Euroelectric in the UK, in Europe, when NL, I think it was NL, Ørsted, and SSE took over the chair, and the deputy chairs suddenly became more ambitious than the EU. I think the other key thing is to be open about disagreements, right? Because if you have systemic, if you're talking about systemic collaboration, there are trade-offs, right? There'll be supply, demand, finance, investor, investee, and try not to force unanimity too soon, because what I like to think is that when two intelligent people disagree about the route to the same objective, it's really worth paying attention. Not saying, shut up, you're wrong, let me prove you. And often we're trained to debate, and the word debate has the word battre in it, like, to hammer in, and we're trained to win, and quite often in collaboration, winning the argument becomes more important than understanding. So we need to let go of thinking that it's possible to really know the route to the future, and pay real attention when committed individuals and companies and policymakers disagree. And I think the last point I'd say is that getting alignment on intermediate goals is one of the most powerful things, and we found just in this last 12 months really concentrating on that. There's an amazing collaboration in shipping called Getting to Zero. So there's lots of good stuff happening, but we work with them to agree a 2030 goal for the whole industry in terms of the percentage of international shipping that is net zero by 2030. And actually that same target then got adopted by the Mission Innovation Collaboration, which is 23 countries responsible for over 80% of national R&D spend. Same things happen on hydrogen, where we've got the Green Hydrogen Coalition in the private sector, and then the Americans have launched a hydrogen Earthshot. So I think when you start getting collaborations from different parts of the ecosystem agreeing on the intermediate goal, then some real magic. It's the kind of moonshot magic, because it drives a lot of the innovation. So you maybe don't have to worry quite so much about the detailed steps, but if everyone's working to the same goal.
Brun, what I'm going to do, we have a last question from the audience. We only have 5 minutes left. So we'll ask the dear lady to ask their question, but I want you to think about a short statement that can include the answer to the question, of course, but also what you took away from this discussion. And I now hope that we're still able to wrap up by the time. Fanny.
Thank you. So Fanny Bancor from the consultancy BL Evolution. My question for Danone, Accor, and Iberostar is basically it's a race to zero, and we don't really know yet what is zero. Well, there is a lot of debate on what is zero and where you are at and how much efforts needs to be put in this. But it's a race, we have to go there fast. So how do you allocate resources between starting to work now on the pressure that we all know and that have been identified, and you know how to do stuff to start to go there, but you also need some resources to know this zero and to be sure you go in the right direction. So how do you allocate resources between starting the work and understanding this zero and defining a goal? Thank you.
Thank you. I would say by collaborating. So perhaps, and that brings together your answer and the other one. Just to give you a very concrete example. So when I was in government, I really wanted the fashion industry to move fast. And so we had two ways of addressing the issue. Either regulate, which would have been basically pointless because, France is a small country in the world, and a lot of the fashion industry actually happens in Asia and in places like this. Or we would have needed to wait or fight for an international treaty on fashion and textile and the impact. So neither would have worked. It would have taken ages. And so what we said, and we went to the private companies and we said, look, we have targets. carbon neutrality by 2050, and you have to address biodiversity as well. So just find a way of working together, and we'll reward some of the most, not necessarily reward, but at least we'll try and do everything we can to turn some of the standards that you're actually setting into policy. And so that's what we did, and it's currently underway, and it's kind of a success. And so, well, hopefully at some point. So on the other hand, I think this is exactly the way to do it. It's a way of de-risking. Because actually you're talking about balancing risk, right? It's a strategy question. So if you want to de-risk, well, you just have to collaborate. If I work with Iberostar in the Maldives or the Dominican Republic, if we tackle the issue of coral reef protection, then I know with twice. Anyway, you've understood what I mean. Collaboration can actually lead to really a lot of de-risking, and I think this is one of the key reasons. So instead of saying, well, where do I allocate the resources, I would say, where and how can I collaborate to actually de-risk and move forward. I have a lot of other things to say, but I'm mindful of time, and so I would like on that front, and so I'm just want to share the floor with my colleagues.
Great. Yeah. So there's 2 minutes left, but we are allowed to go a little bit over. But I think it would be good that each of you quickly intervene. And I know Chris Buss is at the back there, who his picture is on the screen, but he's not even listening to us because he can't hear us without having the thing. But hopefully he will be able to join us briefly as well. So coming back to you, so what do you pick up from these discussions? I picked up quite a lot of things, and I'm really wanting to share some of that thinking with you. But I would like to hear from you. I mean, you were in the fire of the action under the very hot lights, and so I'm very curious to hear from you. Who wants to go? Jan.
I think it was very interesting to have industry coming from a very different sector, which is non-industrial, and to realize that actually not only what's at stake is similar, but also the solutions are similar. And for me, this was really a realization. We've talked a lot about collaboration. That's something which is very difficult, and radical collaboration is probably even more of a challenge. But I think this is where we are going to win the game, and it's not only about pre-competitive in the same industry, because there you have the same language, you have the same code. But when you need to collaborate across industries or even across, private, public sectors, then you are confronted with different codes, different behaviors, different ways of thinking, and this is where we each have a lot of work on ourselves to do. So I think these are the two things I picked up. One is, the similarity across very diverse sectors, and the great need for radical collaboration.
Thank you very much, Jan. Who wants to go next? Dimitri? And then next.
I think I will tell you that I am a father of a son of 6, and I think I am questioning myself all the time about the way I educate them. I educate him, but I have other people where I'm trying to infuse a little bit of education. But I think the key point around all of that is to question yourself, question the way, you are not, you can be a company that has been set up for decades, for centuries, but we have to question ourselves about what is a good level of commitment, what is the good level of change we want to do. Everybody is speaking about business transformation, about sustainability commitment, but few are really taking into account what type of growth model do I want to have? How can I embark the full value chain and all of that? So, and it's by raising questions that you are improving yourself on your private and your professional life. First point. And secondly, needs to happen the time of taking clear actions. And we can see that there are some bottlenecks, like I said, for the Generation Glasgow. Explain it. Say that to your board, say that to your executive committee, say that to your lead of talent. I am not trained for that, but you can say that you are facing some blocking point and barriers. But I think when you will pass over your career, by just explaining clearly what is the elephant that you have in the room of each companies, will conduct to very clear actions and proposal in order to move forward. And we cannot wait 2030 to move forward. We have to act now, and by raising key questions, key issues, elephant in the room, we can move forward and faster.
I think I would maybe start this with a question, which if you are watching or if you are a business or if you work with businesses, what do you want your business legacy to be? And if you are able to treat the response to the pandemic, which society took incredibly seriously and businesses took incredibly seriously, as serious as the issue of climate change and biodiversity loss, then you should be able to recognize that in order to have that sort of legacy of not being the generation that was so aggressively competitive in so many ways and aspects, then you need to be thinking about how it is you can have incredible governance expertise in a C-suite set of meetings. You need to be thinking about your head of procurement also having the expertise in terms of sustainability or bringing in the sciences and how you provide this in this context. And so I think in order to make swift, sweeping changes, which all businesses just had practice doing in response to the pandemic, we need to be treating the same way to the climate and biodiversity crisis.
I mean, just to riff off that, I'd say my number one summary is this is urgent. I mean, because we use the race metaphor resonates because people know this really is urgent. And so, and many people, there's been a lot of pragmatism, I think, as you expect from the business leaders on the panel. I mean, don't make the perfection the enemy of the good, or what did you say, progress over perfection. Yeah, start by just committing to the end goal. So I'd say everybody here join the race to zero, commit to science-based targets for nature as well. So you're committing to the complexity and the trade-offs between the planetary boundaries, but just get in, because you'll be forced in by regulation, by customers, and by investors. So you might as well start thinking about it and acting now. Second thing is it's not the race to zero, and it's not 2050 that's the real goal, right? We know that we have to go beyond zero and earlier than 2050. Okay, so don't get. It's a simple brand name for a campaign, Race to Zero, right? But what we really want is a race to, healing the climate in the 2030s, because for all the reasons we know, and I think the pressure's only going to mount on that. And in fact, it's multiple races, because it's a race to zero, it's the race to resilience, it's the race to nature positive. Ultimately, that's all one race to regeneration, so that the economy actually works for people and planet, rather than us working for the economy and the planet working for the economy. And that's a really exciting transformation, which in 100 years' time we'll look back on and see this is a period where we grappled with existential challenges and transformed the way we live with each other and with the planet to a much better destination than we're headed on if we continue in the ways we're on now.
Well, I'd say what I took out from this session is really the idea of boundary. I think this is what we need to question constantly. So be it in the way we measure things in private companies, but also where and with whom do we need to collaborate. And I mean, the whole idea of boundaries is really something that is absolutely critical, and that we should keep not only embracing, but also questioning, and that's it.
Thank you very much. I mean, we are a little bit over time, but people are still watching us on stream and think you are also there. I mean, this was a great panel. People that know me know that I've been already drawing a map, a systems map of what we heard. So Nigel, when you started, you described three things. There is a race to resilience, where clearly the link to nature is there, because resilience is what nature does. There is a race to climate finance lines to zero. So it's the financial community, and Martin actually challenged us on making sure that all these things are bringing a return on investment, and that the nature positive actions are rewarded, and that the nature negative activities are penalized. And then there is the actual race to zero, where it requires radical collaboration, and there are platforms that are working on the public-private side. That it needs to be science-based, not science-based just strictly on the targets, but also on the solutions, so that we actually measuring progress. And then it requires really action, because we can't wait for the systems and the standards to be perfect. We need to get to action now. And the beautiful thing is if you're working on nature-based solutions, on nature, on biodiversity, these are concrete actions that are changing livelihoods and well-beings of people. Perhaps a bit more when you're acting on climate actions to a certain extent, which is more conceptual. And the urgency you clearly highlighted. And I will end with the note that Bryn actually said on the new boundaries. The ultimate goal is the system change. And the one system that needs to be changed is the economic and finance system today, because it is not conducive to what we have. So we know we've got a biodiversity crisis, we know we've got a climate crisis, but we also have an economic crisis. And it's actually that economics and finance system that has to change. But I'd like to end with one thing that I really liked from this talk, is the impatience that you wanted to, let's do it. Stop talking about it and let's do it. So thank you. Big round of applause for our panelists and for the great contribution they gave us today.